Albert Speer entered the Reich Chancellery expecting a familiar scene: rage, accusations, demands for impossible production figures. The kind of meeting that had defined Germany's final year of war. The Reich was collapsing on every front. In the east, the Red Army was already approaching the Oder. In the west, Allied forces were breaking through the last defensive lines. German cities were without fuel, without air cover, and increasingly without food. Speer expected Hitler to react like a commander under pressure. Instead, he heard something colder. Hitler's voice was steady, controlled, almost clinical. Germany, he said, was finished. And if Germany was finished, then Germany did not deserve to survive. Speer stood in silence as Hitler began dictating an order. But this was not a directive aimed at the advancing Allied armies. It was aimed inward, at the nation itself. Everything that allowed a modern society to function was to be erased. Hitler did not frame it as strategy. He framed it as judgment. If the German people could not win, he believed they had proven themselves weak. And in his view, weakness had no right to a future. Speer left the meeting carrying the document that would later become known as the Nero Decree. In his hands was not a war plan, but a blueprint for national ruin. And as he walked out of the Chancellery, Speer understood the meaning of what had just happened. This was no longer about defeating the enemy. It was about punishing Germany for failing its leader. The central question is not whether Hitler had become irrational in 1945. The question is why the Nazi system still obeyed him, even when his final command meant destroying Germany from the inside. By early 1945, Germany's position was no longer up for debate. It was a clear defeat. In the West, American and British forces were pressing toward the Rhine with overwhelming air and artillery support. The Luftwaffe was almost absent. German armored reserves existed mostly in reports, and the rail system, the bloodstream of the Reich, was breaking down under bombing and fuel shortages. Yet inside Hitler's headquarters, the language of control remained intact. Orders were still issued as if the Reich functioned normally. Maps were still updated. Front lines were still drawn with rulers and colored pencils. Entire divisions were shifted on paper long after they had been reduced to fragments in the field. This was not simply fantasy. It was the operating method of the Nazi state. Hitler's leadership depended on a set of assumptions that had been dangerous even when Germany was winning. He believed willpower could replace logistics, loyalty could replace competence, and fear could improve planning. For years, the system survived by forcing results through coercion. Men were pushed past exhaustion. Factories were kept running by slave labor. Civilian life was stripped down to the minimum required for war, and any official who spoke honestly risked removal, or worse. That machinery had delayed collapse. It could not prevent it, because by 1945, Germany was no longer fighting enemy armies alone. It was combating logistics, fuel reserves, steel output, rail capacity, replacement manpower, the ability to move food into cities, the ability to keep water systems running under air attack, the ability to repair bridges faster than they were destroyed. Those systems were collapsing faster than propaganda could disguise. Hitler still spoke of holding Germany street by street, city by city, until the enemy bled out. But the people beneath him, soldiers, workers, families in cellars, were beginning to think in different terms. Survival, shelter, warmth, clean water, the next meal. By March 1945, the gap between Hitler's war and Germany's reality had become so wide that it could no longer be managed. Something had to break. And on March 19, 1945, Hitler made his decision. If Germany could not win, then Germany would not be allowed to live. If you're enjoying this video so far, please give us a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us create more videos like this. The official title of Hitler's command sounded administrative. It was called Decree Concerning Demolitions in the Reich Territory. But the meaning behind this was direct. If German territory could no longer be held, then Germany itself was to be dismantled completely. The order targeted the foundations of modern life. Not weapons alone, but the systems that allowed a nation to function. Industrial plants and workshops, railway lines and bridges, road junctions and canals, telephone exchanges and radio networks, power stations, gasworks, water and sanitation facilities, warehouses, depots, and fuel storage. Anything the Allies might use after occupying German cities was to be destroyed before they arrived. On paper, this resembled scorched earth strategy, something armies had practiced for centuries during retreat. But in March 1945, Germany was not retreating toward a second homeland. There was no fallback territory behind the Reich, no protected industrial region, no stable rear area. Germany was retreating into its own ruins, and that made the decree different in purpose and consequence. To carry it out was not simply to slow the Allied advance. It was to erase Germany's ability to survive after surrender. It meant darkness without electricity, cities without clean water, transport without rail, hospitals without power, a population already starving pushed toward full collapse. Hitler understood this. His reasoning was no longer military. It was ideological. Speer later recalled that Hitler spoke of the German people as if they had failed a test of worthiness. If they could not win the war, then they did not deserve a future. The stronger nations, he implied, would inherit Europe. Germany would vanish. It was the final expression of Nazi rule, a regime willing to consume its own society rather than accept defeat as reality. But issuing a decree in Berlin was one thing. Enforcing it across a collapsing empire was another. Albert Speer was not an outsider. He was not a resistance figure. He was part of the regime's inner architecture. He had been Hitler's favored builder, then his Minister of Armaments, a man who helped reorganize production, stabilize output, and keep factories working long after Germany's strategic position had become hopeless. Speer understood what efficiency meant in wartime. It meant more weapons, more ammunition, more trains running on time, more replacement parts delivered to collapsing fronts, and it meant the war lasted longer. That is why March 1945 was not a moral awakening. It was calculated. Speer recognized immediately what the Nero Decree would do if it was obeyed in full. Germany's defeat was already inevitable, but Hitler's order would turn defeat into national ruin. The consequences were not theoretical. Without power stations, cities could not pump clean water. Without railways, food could not be moved from rural areas to urban populations. Without bridges, emergency transport stopped. Without communications, even basic administration collapsed. Hospitals would fail first, then sanitation, and finally, public order. Millions of civilians were still alive inside Germany's borders, and they were already surviving on shortages. Speer concluded that if the decree was executed, Germany would not simply lose the war. It would lose the ability to function as a modern society. So he began a second war, quietly, not against the Allies, against Hitler's command. Speer did not confront Hitler in public. He did not issue counterorders in writing. He worked through the only weapon still available in the collapsing Reich: bureaucracy. He contacted regional Gauleiters, industrial managers, railway officials, engineers responsible for utilities, local commanders holding cities and transport hubs. His message was consistent and careful. Delay demolitions. Ignore orders when possible. Claim technical problems. Preserve what can still be preserved. Speer understood that in the final weeks, authority had shifted. Hitler could still sign decrees in Berlin, but the men in the provinces were now facing different pressures. They were surrounded by civilians who were no longer afraid of ideology. They were afraid of hunger, darkness, and disease. Speer's resistance was not heroic. It was pragmatic. He wanted a Germany that could exist after Hitler, and he knew that Hitler, in his final months, no longer wanted Germany to exist at all. What followed was an internal struggle inside the Reich, not between Germany and the Allies, but between the Nazi state and the future it was about to lose. Late March 1945. Across the collapsing German interior. The turning point did not arrive with gunfire in Berlin. It arrived quietly across Germany's interior as orders began to fail. Hitler's decree demanded demolition, not selective destruction, complete and total destruction. In some regions, it was carried out. Bridges were blown as Allied columns approached. Rail junctions were sabotaged. Warehouses were burned. Power stations were prepared for demolition. Factory machinery was wrecked before it could be captured. But in other places, something new appeared inside the Reich. Delay. Local officials claimed they had no explosives. Engineers argued that destruction would trap German troops in their own cities. Railway managers misread schedules. Demolition teams simply did not arrive. Orders disappeared into paperwork. Messages were lost. Telephone lines went unanswered. This was not open rebellion. It was worse for a dictatorship. It was quiet refusal. A regime can survive hatred. It can survive even sabotage, if it can still punish. But it cannot survive when its own machinery stops responding. By late March and early April 1945, German commanders in the field were making decisions without Berlin, not because they had become brave, but because the war had become local. Each town faced the same immediate realities: food, water, shelter, and the movement of refugees. A bridge was not just a military target. It was the only way civilians could flee. A rail line was not just transport. It was the last thread connecting cities to supplies. And the men responsible for these systems understood something Hitler refused to accept. Germany was not fighting for victory anymore. It was fighting for survival after defeat. Hitler responded in the only way he knew. He tightened control on paper. He demanded executions for cowardice and ordered SS units to enforce discipline. He declared cities to be held as fortresses, but the state no longer had the strength to enforce obedience everywhere. The Reich was not simply losing the war. It was losing the ability to function. The Nero Decree accelerated that collapse. It turned retreat into self-destruction, and it forced German officials into a final choice: obey Hitler and destroy their own communities, or disobey and risk being labeled traitors. Many chose disobedience, not out of morality, but because the war was ending, and because, at last, they could see Hitler clearly. A leader who would burn the country rather than admit defeat. In the final weeks of the war, Germany was already collapsing under enormous strain. Allied bombing had shattered industrial centers. Front lines had torn through cities and farmland. Transportation networks were fractured by constant air attacks. Yet alongside the destruction caused by combat, there was another layer of damage, self-inflicted. Bridges were demolished. Power stations were disabled. Communication lines were cut. Orders were issued to ensure that retreat left nothing usable behind. Even so, the directive was never fully executed, and that partial failure changed the course of Germany's post-war survival. Had the order been carried out completely, the consequences would have extended far beyond military defeat. Water systems would have been irreparable for months. Rail infrastructure would have required years to restore. Food distribution, already fragile, would have collapsed entirely. Disease and famine could have spread across a population already exhausted by 6 years of war. The destruction that did occur was severe. Transportation grids were crippled. Major cities lost electricity and clean water. Industrial output ceased almost entirely in many regions. Civilian suffering deepened, not only because of bombs and artillery, but because the systems that sustained daily life were failing. But the most lasting consequence was psychological. The decree revealed something that many Germans had not fully confronted. The regime did not view the nation as a society to be preserved. It viewed it as an instrument, valuable only so long as it served the war. Once victory was no longer possible, preservation lost its meaning. In late April 1945, Albert Speer later claimed he admitted to Hitler that he had not carried out the order in full. According to Speer, Hitler's response was not outrage. It was a quiet acknowledgement. By that stage, Hitler was no longer directing strategy. He was passing judgment on his generals, on his ministers, and on the German people themselves. The decree exposed the final logic of Nazi rule. It was not built on national continuity. It was built on myth, on the belief that struggle justified all sacrifice. And when that myth collapsed, the answer was not reform or retreat. It was annihilation, not of the enemy alone, but of the country that had failed to secure victory. Hitler's final order did not single-handedly destroy Germany. The destruction came from a war the regime had chosen to wage, and from an ideology that treated entire populations as expendable. But the Nero Decree stands as one of the clearest moments in modern history when a government openly directed harm toward its own society, through formal instruction, not hidden violence. By early 1945, Germany was exhausted. Cities were in ruins. Soldiers were retreating on every front. Civilians were displaced and hungry. Yet the leadership did not turn toward preservation. It demanded further sacrifice. The decree crossed a final line. It required the nation to dismantle itself rather than accept defeat. In that decision, the true structure of the regime became visible. The state did not exist to safeguard its people. The people existed to sustain the state's ambitions. When victory proved impossible, there was no path toward recovery, only destruction. That is why the order still matters. It was not simply the impulse of one man in isolation. It was the logical conclusion of a system that had always placed ideology above survival. And when reality could no longer be denied, that system collapsed, not only under external pressure, but from its own design. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us create more videos like this. Until next time, my history lovers.